No credit, continuing education units, or certificate of completion is available for viewing this video. To receive credit for completion of the California EVCS Accessibility Training, access the DSA Academy website to complete the training and a learning assessment.
Welcome to California EVCS Accessibility, a presentation by the Division of the State Architect regarding accessibility regulations for electric vehicle charging stations, updated for the California Building Code and the California Green Building Standards Code, intervening code cycle supplement. These regulations became effective in California July 1st, 2021. EV charging in Cal Green. In this section, we will be discussing the 2019 requirements for electric vehicle charging in Cal Green for both non-residential and residential facilities. California leads the way in electric vehicle charging. This began with ambitious executive orders set forth by former California Governor Edmund G. Brown Jr. B-16-2012 requires the support of up to 1 million vehicles with zero-emission vehicle infrastructure by 2020. Executive Order B-30-2015 sets target of greenhouse gas emissions for 40% less than 1990 levels by 2030. And Executive Order B-55-2018 requires California to achieve statewide carbon neutrality by 2045. These ambitious executive orders will go a long way to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in California. Governor Gavin Newsom has expanded these ambitious goals with Executive Order N-1919, which requires every aspect of state government to redouble its efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impacts of climate change while building a sustainable, inclusive economy. And N-7920 requires 100% of new vehicles sold in the state to be zero-emission vehicles by 2035, which means they either need to be battery electric or fuel cell electric. The 2019 Cal Green requirements requires electric vehicle infrastructure and EV spaces for new residential facilities and non-residential facilities. Cal Green defines an EV space as a space provided with EV infrastructure intended for future installation of EV charging equipment. The 2019 Cal Green requirements do not require chargers to be installed. There is also no requirement for EV spaces to be marked or reserved until EV chargers are installed for use, and the spaces can be used as a parking space until chargers are installed. Future electric vehicle charging spaces shall count towards the total parking spaces required by the local enforcing agency according to the vehicle code, which means when the local enforcing agency specifies a certain number of parking spaces for these residential facilities, you can arrive at that specific number by using both electric vehicle spaces and parking spaces. So what do we mean when we say there are mandatory measures for EV infrastructure? Well, the 2019 Cal Green has specific requirements. These are a listed raceway capable of accommodating a 208-240 volt dedicated branch circuit, minimum trade size 1. Raceway shall originate at the main service or sub-panel and terminate in an enclosure in close proximity to the proposed EV space. The service panel and or sub-panel shall provide capacity to install a 40 amp minimum dedicated branch circuit to each proposed EV space. And for multiple EV spaces, the panel capacity and electrical system shall have sufficient capacity to simultaneously charge all EVs at full rated amperage of the electric vehicle supply equipment. Definitions for words used in electric vehicle charging regulations can be found in Chapter 2 of Cal Green. These specific words are electric vehicle charger, electric vehicle charging space, electric vehicle charging station, and electric vehicle supply equipment. Any other words that are not defined specifically in Chapter 2 that are in the regulations, you would consult a collegiate dictionary. In this section, we will be presenting the EV charging infrastructure residential requirements in Cal Green, which can be found in Cal Green Chapter 4. Cal Green has mandatory measures, which are mandatory requirements to install electric vehicle charging. In residential facilities, these mandatory measures apply to new 1- and 2-family dwellings and to townhouses with attached private garages and to new multifamily residential facilities. For multifamily developments, the EV spaces are calculated at 10% of parking spaces. For multifamily developments, at least one EV space shall be in a common use area and available for use by all residents. CalGreen also has voluntary measures, which means you can go beyond the mandatory measures and provide for an increase in electric vehicle infrastructure, which affords greater sustainability. For Tier 1 electric vehicle spaces are calculated at 15% of parking spaces provided. And for Tier 2, which provides even greater sustainability, EV spaces are calculated at 20% of parking spaces provided. In multifamily residential facilities where parking is available, the first EV space shall be located in a common use parking area and shall be available for use by all residents. This EV space should plan for future accessibility as required in CalGreen. Specifically for private housing, the space needs to be located adjacent to an accessible parking space meeting the requirements of CBC Chapter 11A and able to share an access aisle. This space, located next to an accessible parking space, will already be on an accessible route to the building because CBC Chapter 11A requirements require an accessible route to the building from accessible parking spaces. Alternatively, this EV space can be located in a different area of the parking facility, provided an accessible route to the building is also provided. CalGreen also requires every one of 25 accessible EV spaces shall be 9 feet wide by 18 feet long with an 8-foot access aisle, or 12 feet wide by 18 feet long with a 5-foot wide access aisle. Every other accessible EV space shall be 9 feet wide by 18 feet long with a 5-foot wide access aisle. Surface slopes for EV spaces and access aisles are required to be 1 in 48 maximum, or approximately 2% in any direction. CalGreen requires that public housing facilities refer to CBC Chapter 11B for accessibility requirements. What is public housing? Well, Chapter 2 of the California Building Code defines public housing as housing facilities constructed or altered by, for, or on behalf of a public entity, or constructed or altered as part of a public entity's program to provide housing according to federal law. And it includes, but is not limited to, 1 or 2 family dwellings or congregate residences, buildings or complexes with 3 or more residential dwelling units, homeless shelters, group homes, halfway houses, and similar social service establishments, transient lodging, such as hotels, motels, hostels, and other facilities providing accommodations of a short-term nature of not more than 30 days duration, and housing at a place of education, such as housing serving employees, faculty, or students at a private or public school, college, or university. As previously stated, the requirements in CalGreen for multifamily residential facilities require the first EV space to be located in the common use parking area and to be available for use by all residents. When planning for future accessibility to electric vehicle charging stations in public housing, it is important to remember that this EV space in visitor or unassigned tenant parking areas shall be accessible per the California Building Code Chapter 11B accessibility requirements and not the requirements that are stated in CalGreen. It's important to refer to the CBC Chapter 11B for regulations addressing shared access aisles, accessible routes, number of accessible EV spaces required based on EV spaces provided, and the EV space size requirements. In this section, we will be presenting the EV charging infrastructure non-residential requirements in CalGreen, which can be found in CalGreen Chapter 5. The Cal Green mandatory measures requires new non-residential construction to provide a minimum number of EV spaces with infrastructure if parking is provided. For parking areas that have from 0 to 200 parking spaces, a specified number according to the table is required. For 201 parking spaces and over, 10% of spaces require EV infrastructure. For greater sustainability, voluntary Tier 1 measures require 17% of parking spaces to be provided with EV infrastructure, and the Tier 2 requirements under the voluntary measure require 22% of parking spaces to be provided with EV infrastructure. The Cal Green non-residential mandatory measures do not direct new non-residential facilities that are public accommodations, commercial facilities, or public facilities to the electric vehicle charging station accessibility requirements of CBC Chapter 11B. For new non-residential facilities, Cal Green requires that only infrastructure be installed to future EV spaces. It does not require chargers to be installed. Accessibility is not required when only infrastructure is installed because the charging service is not yet provided, absent the chargers. Also, existing non-residential facilities, the installation of electric vehicle charging stations is voluntary. However, if charging stations are installed in existing non-residential facilities, and they are also public accommodations, commercial facilities, or public facilities, then they are required to comply with the accessibility requirements of CBC Chapter 11B. Whether the facility is new or existing, if charging service is provided in public use or employee use areas, accessibility to electric vehicle charging stations is required by state and federal law.
In this section, we'll be discussing the federal accessibility requirements to electric vehicle charging, upon which the California requirements in the California Building Code Chapter 11B regulations are based. Federal accessibility requirements are specified in the Americans with Disabilities Act, more commonly known as the ADA. If electric vehicle charging stations are provided for use by the general public in state and local government facilities, public accommodations, and commercial facilities, then they must be accessible to individuals with disabilities. ADA Title II covers the programs and services provided by a state or local government. A service such as electric vehicle charging provided in a public facility or electric vehicle charging provided in public housing must be accessible. Under ADA Title III, access to goods and services provided by a privately owned public accommodation must also be accessible, such as electric vehicle charging provided in a shopping center or electric vehicle charging provided for general employee use in an office building.
If you were to pick up a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines, the ADAG, you would see that technical requirements for electric vehicle charging stations are not specifically addressed. The ADA is civil rights law, and it is quite broad-based and basically states that if there is a program offered by a Title II entity, a state and local government, or a service offered by Title III entity, which is privately owned public accommodations, it must be accessible. Electric vehicle charging stations are a program that's provided by a Title II entity if it's in a public facility, and it is a service provided by a Title III entity if it is in a public accommodation, and therefore must be accessible. There are no federal accessibility standards specific to the design of electric vehicle charging stations, even though accessibility to electric vehicle charging stations is required under civil rights law. And legal precedents specify that lack of explicit scoping or technical requirements does not relieve ADA Title II and ADA Title III entities from the obligation to provide access.
In California, the Division of the State Architect has the authority to write the accessibility regulations in the California Building Code for the state of California. Because there is no specific guidelines in the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines for electric vehicle charging, DSA consulted with the United States Access Board, who provided the following guidance. An electric vehicle does not need to charge every time it's parked. Therefore, public and common use electric vehicle charging stations are charging spaces and not parking spaces. While an electric vehicle needs to be in a parked state to charge, charging and not parking is the primary purpose of an electric vehicle charging station. EV charging is a service provided the facility owner or public entity and therefore must be accessible to individuals with disabilities. It's also important to note that EV charging and parking are separate services provided by either a state or local government or a privately owned public accommodation, and they are distinct and separate services.
In this section, we'll discuss how the Division of the State Architect developed the regulations for electric vehicle charging in California Building Code Chapter 11B. The Division of the State Architect began its regulatory development late in 2014 by assembling a working group of stakeholders to address accessibility concerns regarding electric vehicle charging stations, from which the accessibility regulations in the California Building Code would be developed. By providing specific scoping and technical requirements, jurisdictional agencies could review for compliance to ensure accessibility to new electric vehicle charging stations was provided. The benefit of the regulations as well for individuals with disabilities is that wherever electric vehicle charging was provided in California that was available for public use, individuals with disabilities would find consistency in the requirements. The Division of the State Architect in developing regulations for accessibility needs to ensure that the process involves all stakeholders, both code beneficiaries and code users. Code beneficiaries are the individuals with disabilities, so they can have access to and use the electric vehicle charging stations. Code users, for example, are building officials and architects because they need to design these facilities to be accessible. The electric vehicle charging station working group of stakeholders included the following groups: individuals with disabilities, disability advocates, access professionals, building officials, architects, state agencies, EV charger manufacturers, electric utility companies, building industry representatives, and EV advocates. This working group of stakeholders discussed and presented their needs, and from those discussions, the Division of the State Architect established the regulations. The regulatory development process is established in California statute. For the electric vehicle charging station accessibility regulations, the timeline is as follows. The Division of the State Architect established the working group in September of 2014. In June of 2015, draft regulations were submitted to the Building Standards Commission Code Advisory Committee for comment. In August of 2015, the regulations were available for public review and comment. In January of 2016, the Building Standards Commission took action and approved the regulations. In July of 2016, the regulations were published in the 2016 edition of the California Building Code, and in January of 2017, the regulations became effective with the effective date of the 2016 California Building Code. The regulations were further amended in September of 2020 due to advancements in the electric vehicle charging station industry that necessitated DSA to once again look at and review the regulations to ensure accessibility is provided. The original 2016 California Building Code regulations for electric vehicle charging stations and the amendments made to the regulations in September of 2020 are covered in the next portion of the presentation. These regulations became effective July 1st, 2021, and are applicable to installations of electric vehicle charging stations in both new and existing facilities that are either public housing, public accommodations, commercial facilities, or public buildings. In this section, we will detail the specific scoping and technical requirements for electric vehicle charging station accessibility as stated in CBC Chapter 11B. The Chapter 11B accessibility regulations do not require either parking or electric vehicle charging stations to be installed at a facility. Parking requirements are usually stipulated in local zoning ordinances. Electric vehicle charging station requirements are stipulated in CalGreen for new facilities, but may also be stipulated in local zoning ordinances. In new facilities, CalGreen requires only infrastructure to be installed based upon the number of parking spaces provided. It does not require chargers to be installed. In existing facilities, the installation of electric vehicle charging stations is voluntary. However, when charging service is provided, meaning chargers are provided to EV spaces and charging is in effect, then the accessibility regulations are triggered. As previously stated in the California Building Code, Chapter 11B, charging spaces and parking spaces are separate services and have distinct separate requirements. In California statute, accessible parking spaces have a specific design requirement for signs and markings that reserves parking for an individual with disabilities. In these parking spaces, an individual with a disability that has a parking placard with an international symbol of accessibility, an ISA, on it, can park in accessible parking spaces for an unlimited amount of time. Charging spaces are different. Per the California Department of Motor Vehicles, electric vehicle charging stations are zones reserved for special types of vehicles in which the right to park for unlimited periods of time does not apply. And vehicles that display accessible license plates or placards may not park for an unlimited period of time in an accessible electric vehicle charging station identified by an ISA or International Symbol of Accessibility, where the length of time is restricted or metered. When the parking or electric vehicle charging service is provided at a facility, then the CBC accessibility requirements apply. The CBC accessibility requirements are separated in the scoping provisions in Chapter 2 and then the technical provisions in the subsequent chapters. Both need to be consulted in order to provide the necessary accessibility. Scoping provisions address questions such as where and how many. Technical provisions address questions such as what elements are regulated and how are they made accessible. For parking service, the scoping provisions are in CBC 11B 208. The technical provisions are in CBC 11B 502. For electric vehicle charging, the scoping provisions are in CBC 11B 228.3, and the technical provisions are in CBC 11B 812. The regulations in Chapter 11B do not specify where in a parking facility electric vehicle charging stations shall be located. However, there are important facility planning considerations to take into account. Specifically, the location of charging station proximity to the electrical service and electric vehicle supply equipment, and also the location of charging stations in consideration of accessible routes, because an accessible route is required from the charging station to the building entrance where a charging station parking facility serves a particular building or facility, or the accessible route from the charging station to the site boundary for a standalone charging station parking facility that does not serve a particular building or facility. An example of a charging facility that does not serve a particular building or facility would be a city-owned parking garage that serves a general area of the city. When planning for electric vehicle charging stations, it is important to consider the service level of charging that will be provided at the facility. There are 3 different service levels of charging. AC Level 1 has a charge time typically of 3 miles range per hour. AC Level 2 has a charge time typically of 25 to 30 miles range per hour. and DC fast charge has a charge time of 250 miles range per hour. The charger also can have one of 4 different connector types. AC Level 1 and AC Level 2 chargers have an SAE J1772 or J-plug. DC fast chargers usually have either Shademo or CCS. Shademo is typical for Nissan and Mitsubishi models. CCS services American and European models, Honda, Kia, and Hyundai. Tesla serves only Tesla cars. Each charger level and connector type is considered a facility for purpose of CBC accessibility scoping, which means when you refer to the table that tells you how many of the EV spaces need to be accessible, you would need to consider the combination of the connector type and service level offered and apply the table to each combination to ensure the necessary accessibility is provided. However, a facility owner can only provide one charge level and one connector type if they wish, or a range of variety of charge level and connector type. It is their choice. To provide the necessary accessibility to electric vehicle charging stations, it is important to use the CBC correctly. First, we begin to definitions applicable to electric vehicle charging stations, which are found in Chapter 2, Section 202. Then we proceed to scoping, which tells us what type. Is it van accessible, standard accessible, ambulatory, or drive-up? And how many of each do we need? These can be found in Chapter 11B, Division 2, Section 11B 228.3. Then we proceed to the technical requirements. How do we make the EV charging spaces accessible? These can be found in Chapter 11B, Division 8, Section 11B 812. Correct use of the CBC requires us to start in Chapter 2 with the definitions that apply to electric vehicle charging. The words defined in Chapter 2 related to electric vehicle charging include drive-up electric vehicle charging station, electric vehicle charger, electric vehicle charging space, electric vehicle charging station, and electric vehicle connector. Other words that may not be defined in Chapter 2, you would look to a collegiate dictionary. It's also important to remember that while the CBC and Cal Green use similar terminology, their definitions may be different. So when they're used in Cal Green, you should consult the definitions in Chapter 2 of Cal Green. When they're used in the California Building Code, you need to consult the definitions in Chapter 2 of the California Building Code. The scoping requirements found in Chapter 11B, Division 2, Section 11B-228 tell us the minimum number by type of electric vehicle charging stations required to comply with the technical provisions of 11B 812. This is based on the total number of electric vehicle charging stations provided at a facility. For example, if 1 to 4 electric vehicle charging stations are provided at a facility, one of those spaces needs to be van accessible, 0 of the spaces need to be standard accessible, and 0 of the spaces need to be ambulatory. If there are 76 to 100 electric vehicle charging stations provided at a facility, one of those spaces needs to be van accessible, 3 needs to be standard accessible, and 3 need to be ambulatory. We will explain the differences between the van accessible, standard accessible, and ambulatory accessible spaces later in the technical requirements. It's also important to know that when an EV charger can simultaneously charge more than one vehicle, the number of electric vehicle charging stations provided shall be considered equivalent to the number of electric vehicles that can be simultaneously charged. For example, if a charger has 2 connectors, that would be considered 2 electric vehicle charging stations for purposes of this table. Minutes ago, we discussed service level of charging and connector types. This is a reminder that for each charger level and connector type provided, that combination is considered a facility for purposes of CBC accessibility scoping. you would use the previous table, Table 11B-228.3.2.1, for each combination offered at a facility. There are two exceptions to meeting compliance with the minimum number of accessible electric vehicle charging stations specified in Table 11B-228.3.2.1. Electric vehicle charging stations that are not available to the general public and intended for use by a designated vehicle or driver. For example, public or private fleet vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations assigned to an employee. In public housing facilities, electric vehicle charging stations intended for use by an EV owner or operator at their residence, meaning it's provided in a private garage or assigned to an EV owner. The scoping provisions also specify the requirements for new construction and alterations of electric vehicle charging stations. When new electric vehicle charging stations are added to a site with existing electric vehicle charging stations, the total number of new and existing electric vehicle charging stations is used to determine the number of accessible electric vehicle charging stations per Table 11B-228.3.2.1. The technical provisions in 11B-812 apply only to new and altered electric vehicle charging stations. The California Building Code does not require existing electric vehicle charging stations to be altered to meet the new technical requirements. It's important to remember that operable parts on all new and altered EV chargers must comply with the requirements of CBC 11B-309.4. This means not only the accessible spaces have chargers that require compliance of operable parts with 11B-309.4, all chargers require operable parts in compliance with 11B-309.4, even those in spaces that are not accessible. Table 11B-228.3.2.1 addresses three types of accessible electric vehicle charging stations: van accessible, standard accessible, and ambulatory. These three types you would typically find in a parking lot configuration. Scoping provisions address one additional type, which is the drive-up accessible electric vehicle charging station. This configuration is similar to what you would find at a gas station. Electric vehicle charging station technical requirements are found in CBC 11B-812. We'll be discussing the technical provisions next in the presentation. The van accessible EV space is similar in configuration to a van accessible parking space. The space is 12 feet wide minimum and 18 feet long minimum, with an access aisle that's 5 feet wide minimum located on the passenger side with head-in parking. The space also requires surface marking in 12-inch high letters that reads EV charging only. The combination of a 9-foot wide stall with an 8-foot wide access aisle is not permitted for EV spaces. Since EV cars do not have a consistent location on the vehicle for the charging port, the 12-foot wide vehicle space permits an EV owner to park closer to the access aisle. Since the average width of a car is 7 feet, parking closer to the access aisle permits an additional 5 feet of clear space on the driver's side to maneuver around the vehicle if the charge port is on the driver's side. A standard accessible EV space is similar in configuration to standard accessible parking space. It is 9 feet wide minimum and 18 feet long minimum. An access aisle that's 5 feet minimum is also required, but it can be located on either the passenger or driver's side of the EV space. The space also requires surface marking of 12-inch high letters that reads EV charging only. The ambulatory accessible EV space has no comparable requirement to accessible parking. It is 10 feet wide minimum and 18 feet long minimum. There is no access aisle required. It must have surface markings 12 inches high, reading EV charging only. As previously stated, EV cars do not have a consistent location on the vehicle for the charge port. The 10-foot wide ambulatory accessible vehicle space permits an EV owner to park closer to either line that demarcates the space. Since the average width of a car is 7 feet, Parking closer to either line offers an additional 3 feet of clear space on the driver's side or on the passenger side to maneuver around to access the charge port. This clear space of additional width provides increased access for individuals with limited or temporary mobility challenges. The drive-up accessible EV space is analogous to a motor fuel pump island at a filling station. It is 17 feet wide and 20 feet long. There's no access aisle required and no surface markings to define the space. All drive-up electric vehicle charging stations must meet the specified accessibility requirements. Per Chapter 2, use of the drive-up accessible EV is limited to 30 minutes maximum, as stated in the definition, drive-up accessible EV space. Chapter 11B states that the access aisle must extend the full length of the EV space. It must have a painted border line around the perimeter of the access aisle with hatch lines 36 inches on center maximum and no parking in 12-inch high letters visible from the adjacent vehicular way. Markings must contrast to the vehicle surface, and the blue color required for identification of access aisles in accessible parking shall not be used. Because accessible charging spaces and accessible parking spaces cannot be shared when available for public use, and because accessible charging spaces can provide time limits on the use of the space, accessible charging spaces must use a different color than blue for marking the vehicle space. The access aisle can be shared by 2 accessible EV spaces or by 1 accessible parking space and 1 accessible EV space. Where the access aisle is shared by an accessible parking space and an accessible EV space, the surface identification must comply with the requirements for an accessible parking space access aisle. We had previously stated that van accessible charging spaces must have the access aisle on the passenger side. However, an exception to the rule is provided. Where 4 or fewer total electric vehicle charging stations are provided in a facility, the access aisle for non-angled van accessible spaces may be located on either the driver's side or the passenger side, as permitted by the federal standards. Chapter 11B also tells us when an identification for accessibility is required. For installations of 1 to 4 electric vehicle charging stations, there are no identification signs required, which means no International Symbol of Accessibility, or ISA, is required. For these installations, while an accessible EV space is designed for accessibility, its use is available to everyone and not limited to those with access license plates or placards. For installations of 5 to 25 electric vehicle charging spaces, 1 van accessible EV space shall be identified with an ISA. The standard accessible EV space shall not be required to be identified with an ISA. For installations of 26 or more electric vehicle charging stations, all required van accessible and all required standard accessible shall be identified with an ISA. The ambulatory electric vehicle charging spaces are not required to be identified with an ISA, and the drive-up electric vehicle charging spaces are not required to be identified with an ISA. The International Symbol of Accessibility sign, or ISA sign, shall be reflectorized with a minimum area of 70 square inches. The location of the sign must be adjacent to an EV space or at the head end of the EV space, mounted 60 inches above finished floor to the bottom of the sign, and may be mounted on a wall or mounted 80 inches above finished floor to the bottom of the sign, if in an accessible route. When signs are required, and if the EV space is a van accessible space, then a sign stating van accessible shall also be provided. The CBC also specifies accessibility requirements for the EV charger. Operable parts on the charger and the charging cord storage must comply with a clear floor space at the charger of 30 inches by 48 inches. The operable parts and charging cord storage must be between 15 inches and 48 inches above finished floor, and the operable parts shall not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist, must be operable with one hand, and maximum 5 pounds force. The EV connector, however, is not required to meet the 5-pound activating force. Point-of-sale devices, if supplied on the charger, must comply with accessibility requirements, which also require compliance with operable parts and includes requirements on the screen for sans serif font and character height and contrast requirements. The CBC also specifies the EV charger location. It must be adjacent to and within the projected width of the EV space it serves if the EV charger has one EV connector, within the combined projected width of the EV spaces it serves if the EV charger has multiple EV connectors, and where the EV space is parallel to the vehicular way, the EV charger shall be adjacent to and 48 inches maximum from the head end or foot end of the EV space it serves. In order to effectively charge the vehicle, an accessible route is required, connecting the EV space to the EV charger that serves it. Electric vehicle charging stations shall be designed so accessible routes are not obstructed by cables or other elements, as it is difficult for individuals using wheelchairs to be able to cross over the cables. An accessible route is also required from the electric vehicle charging station to the building entrance where electric vehicle charging stations and parking serves a particular building or facility. An accessible route is required from the electric vehicle charging station to the site boundary for a standalone EVCS parking facility that does not serve a particular building or facility. Often it is helpful to have a graphic that illustrates the requirements. This graphic is for 2 electric vehicle charging stations. The regulations state that when 4 or less electric vehicle charging stations are provided, one must be van accessible. This van accessible space is not required to be signed, so you will see that there are no signage requirements at the head of the space indicating the space is reserved. This space, when there are 4 or fewer electric vehicle charging stations, is available for use by everyone. This illustration shows us 5 electric vehicle charging stations. The regulations tell us that when 5 to 25 electric vehicle charging stations are provided, 2 accessible electric vehicle spaces are required. The first must be van accessible. In this graphic, the van accessible shares an access aisle with the standard accessible. The van accessible space, which is on the left of the access aisle, has an ISA and van accessible sign. The standard accessible space, which is on the right of the access aisle, is a 9-foot wide space and requires no signage. This standard accessible space can be used by anyone. The van accessible space, because it has the ISA sign, is reserved for individuals with disabilities. This graphic illustrates a portion of an electric vehicle charging facility with 26 stations. Only the accessible spaces are illustrated in this graphic. For 26 electric vehicle charging stations, 3 accessible EV spaces are required. In this situation, an example of compliant design would be an ambulatory electric vehicle charging station, which is on the left. You will see that's 10 feet wide. No marking is required. It's not reserved for individuals with disabilities, but does provide greater flexibility and maneuverability around the vehicle. Adjacent to the space in the center, is the van accessible electric vehicle charging station. You will see that it does have an ISA sign and is van accessible at 12 feet wide. This space is reserved for individuals with disabilities. Across the access aisle is the standard accessible space. Because more than 26 electric vehicle charging stations are provided, the standard accessible space must also bear the ISA sign, and it is also reserved for individuals with disabilities. In this section, we'll discuss the installation of electric vehicle charging stations in existing facilities. When electric vehicle charging stations are added to an existing facility, it is by definition an alteration of that facility. An alteration is a change, addition, or modification in construction, change in occupancy or use, or structural repair to an existing building or facility. According to the building code, when alterations or additions are made to existing buildings or facilities, an accessible path of travel to the specific area of alteration or addition shall be provided. These requirements are called path of travel improvements. According to the CBC, electrical projects are typically alterations exempt from path of travel improvements. But while installing electric vehicle charging stations is an electrical project, it is not considered exempt from path of travel improvements because electric vehicle charging stations affect the usability of the facility. Let me try to explain the path of travel improvements a little bit better. The CBC requires alterations to existing facilities to undergo an analysis for accessibility. The area of alteration must be connected to other necessary accessible elements. The connection of these elements is called the path of travel, and elements on the path of travel must be altered to meet the current accessibility requirements of the CBC. The primary accessible path of travel includes the following elements serving the area of alteration: a primary entrance to the building or facility, which by definition includes site arrival points such as the public right-of-way or accessible parking. It also includes toilet and bathing facilities serving the area of alteration, drinking fountains serving the area of alteration, public telephones serving the area of alteration, and signs. After this analysis for accessibility, if these elements are compliant to the current code, no additional work is required to make them accessible. However, if the path of travel is not compliant to current code, they must be improved to reach compliance with the current code. So, how do path of travel improvements apply to the installation of electric vehicle charging stations at an existing facility? Well, there is an exception 10 to 11B202.4, which is the path of travel improvements requirements, that states, when installing new electric vehicle charging stations at existing facilities where vehicle fueling, charging, parking, or storage is a primary function, path of travel improvements are limited to 20% of the cost of the work directly associated with the installation of electric vehicle charging stations. And in this example, it would be electric vehicle charging stations in a parking structure when the parking structure does not serve a specific building. Alterations were the installation of new electric vehicle charging stations at existing facilities where fueling, charging, parking, or storage is not a primary function. Path of travel improvements are not required. So for a parking lot or a parking garage that serves a specific building, then the path of travel improvements would not be required. The requirements for path of travel improvements as it relates to the installation of electric vehicle charging stations at an existing facility are consistent with the following guidance provided by the United States Access Board. While an electric vehicle needs to be in a parked state to recharge, charging is the primary purpose of an electric vehicle charging station. Electric vehicle charging stations are not parking spaces. Therefore, electric vehicle charging stations are not considered a site arrival point. Other alteration projects on a site do not trigger an improvement to existing electric vehicle charging stations under the CBC as a path of travel element. To clarify, we had discussed in the previous slide that the building entrance and site arrival points needed to be improved as part of a path of travel element. So if an alteration was inside the building and the building had a parking lot, and in that parking lot there were electric vehicle charging stations, you would need to provide an analysis of the accessible parking spots for path of travel, but you do not need to improve existing electric vehicle charging stations under the path of travel requirements. Technical infeasibility may apply to an electric vehicle charging installation in an existing facility or to the path of travel improvements required for compliance. Technically infeasible means an alteration of a building or facility that has little likelihood of being accomplished because the existing structural conditions require the removal or alteration of a load-bearing member that is an essential part of the structural frame, or because other existing physical or site constraints prohibit modification or addition of the elements, spaces, or features that are in full and strict compliance with the minimum requirements necessary to provide accessibility. Providing the necessary accessibility may be technically infeasible on a case-by-case basis. A finding of technical infeasibility requires a site-specific assessment of constraints or complications regarding the planned scope of work. When technically infeasible to provide full compliance, the alteration shall provide equivalent facilitation or comply with the requirements to the maximum extent feasible. The details of the finding that full compliance with the requirements is technically infeasible shall be recorded and entered into the files of the enforcing agency. Unreasonable hardship is related to the cost to provide accessibility improvements. The CBC states that when path of travel improvements is required for full compliance with the accessibility requirements and the improvements are an unreasonable hardship, that the minimum compliance requirement is 20% of the adjusted construction cost. Since electric vehicle charging stations installations in existing facilities already limit path of travel improvements to 20% of the adjusted construction cost, unreasonable hardship cannot be applied to providing the required access to electric vehicle charging stations or to the path of travel improvements. In summary, it can only be technically infeasible to provide the required access to electric vehicle charging stations when applicable. Unreasonable hardship cannot be applied to providing the required access to electric vehicle charging stations. As previously stated, an accessible route to the building facility entrance or to the public way, as applicable, is a requirement for the installation of electric vehicle charging stations. The requirement for the accessible route is not a path of travel improvement, and the limit of the 20% of adjusted construction cost cannot be applied to the accessible route requirement. Thank you for listening to this presentation on California Electric Vehicle Charging Station Accessibility. Should you have additional questions, please contact the Division of the State Architect Access Compliance Unit at DSA headquarters in Sacramento. DSA appreciates your interest in understanding the requirements for accessibility when installing electric vehicle charging stations and your commitment in making electric vehicle charging stations in California accessible to individuals with disabilities.